Hey everybody, welcome to Dad, Daughters, and Drinks, where you'll always get at least two of those three. Today we are continuing on our Ren chapters journey with chapter 3. This time it looks like it's in black and white. Maybe each time they're doing something a little different. But I'm not sure what the topic of today is going to be, so let's go ahead and get started. It's already starting off with his therapist is scowling at him weakly, according to the subtitles.
My therapist was scowling at my weekly anxiety and depression scores like a detective trying to crack a particularly stubborn case. There were no signs of improvement, and the scores followed no real measurable pattern that were consistent with bipolar. After nearly 2 years of talk therapy and taking enough medications to fill a pharmacy, he sat down with me and he dropped the bombshell that he didn't think that I had bipolar. In fact, he said that he didn't think that I had depression at all. And it was a very odd thing to be stripped of an identity in an instant.
Yeah, that's got to be weird, I guess. You almost, as much as you don't want to be depressed and bipolar, if you think you are, the doctors have told you you are, and they're trying to treat you for that, at least you feel like there's a problem that can be fixed in a way, right? Because now what you're dealing with is uncertainty. Like, I don't even know what the problem actually is, which is almost a step backwards, I would think. And after that amount of time, that's got to be pretty horrible.
Depression at all. And it was a very odd thing to be stripped of an identity in an instant. The reality was that a 20-minute in and out consultation 2 years ago led to 2 years of swallowing pills that I never needed and devoting so much of my time to managing the condition that I never actually had.
We kind of talked about that in, I think, the first video, maybe it was chapter 2, where a lot of times I think in the medical community, like there's the initial diagnosis and then you get this cascading series of issues if it's incorrect, or I mean, even if correct necessarily, but you know, the first guy or girl, I use guy as generic, right? First doctor is going to make a diagnosis or make some, you know, observations. And if those are wrong, it's very difficult to correct that. It's almost like, and I don't remember if I made this analogy on the last one, but it's like a law precedent, right? So much of the law is built on the precedent of previous cases. And, you know, if there's some older case where there was just some sort of a really bad ruling, it becomes difficult to get out of that because all of a sudden you get so many other, you know, laws and rulings and things that were passed. I think I said laws, but I'm thinking more about rulings. You get so many rulings that are passed in court cases that are based on precedents that it becomes a little bit difficult to course correct, I think. I think something similar kind of happens in medicine on things that are more complicated to diagnose.
The emotions inside me swirled around like a mismatched soup. On one hand, I was full of anger and I was bitter about the whole situation. But I was also hopeful that this new path could offer me the relief that I desperately needed. He told me he was going to refer me to an ME clinic in Bath. I'd never heard of it before, but instinctively true to character, I started researching it online as soon as I got home. Apparently, ME is the medical equivalent of a choose-your-own-adventure book, with tiredness as the only consistent plotline. There were no universally accepted reasons as to why the fuck it existed in the first place. It seemed it was largely accepted to be a post-viral condition, but that was all speculative because there were no clear consensus in the medical community what ME even was. The defining characteristic was a tiredness that wouldn't go away with rest. I could relate to this. In fact, I could more than relate to it. For anyone lucky enough to have not have experienced this, if you want an idea of what it's like, force yourself to stay awake for 3 nights in a row. During this time, eat the food that makes you feel terrible, and in this sleep-deprived state, exercise until your muscles give out. By the 3rd day, you'll have a small insight into living with this condition. During the years post-stem cell transplant.
That's Batman, right? What's his name? Christian Bale? Is that him from, what movie is that? The Mechanic? I'm not entirely sure. I think that might be the case. If not, let me know.
A small insight into living with this condition. During the years post-stem cell transplant, where I recovered a lot of my health and functionality, I remember getting COVID and thinking it was a walk in the park compared to the first year of my illness. The difference was COVID lasted about a week. The thick of my illness lasted 8 years, and it only was getting worse. I pinned a lot of hope on going to that first visit at the ME clinic. It was a 6-month waiting list, God bless NHS wait times, but I felt excited to be surrounded by people who would understand me, where I could climb out of this nightmare, but my hopes were pretty quickly crushed during that first visit. I remember walking into a space that looked like a disused classroom where a bunch of people on chairs were sitting around in circles like Alcoholics Anonymous. I could feel a sense of camaraderie in that we all felt like dog shit. We were all confused and we were all desperately wanting to feel better. I believe at the time I was probably the youngest in the group. The group leader waddled in and handed us all a booklet that looked like a school timetable. She then sat us down and told about this new revolutionary technique called pacing.
Yeah, he said, I think in one of those videos where it showed the stats about ME, that the average age was like 30 to 60. So it wouldn't be surprising if he was the youngest person in the group, I think.
Where you write down and track everything that you do in a day.
Although, if you watch the movie, what's it called? Awake? The documentary that he plays Patience in, and then he's got, they show a clip of him on one of his vlogs. Most of the people, if I remember correctly, in that movie are younger people. So it doesn't seem like it's just, strictly older people. I mean, at my age, 30 is younger, but I suppose it's all relative.
This new revolutionary technique called pacing, where you write down and track everything that you do in a day, and then you do it less. And then with time, do it more again. The theory being that you have a limited bucket of energy compared to normal people, and you need to protect that and gradually push it. I thought this sounded pretty stupid, so I raised my hand.
Yeah, that does sound kind of dumb. I mean, I guess I could get like where somebody who isn't familiar with the human body might come up with this kind of a theory, but it doesn't really actually make sense. It's not like you have a limited bucket of energy that you're based on, the type of, things that they're talking about with this massive exhaustion. It's not like you're, a normal person has 1,000 units, and if you've got MA, you've only got 200, and so now you need to try and better allocate your 200 units of energy. That doesn't make sense.
I told her about the pain in my body. I told her that my muscles twitched constantly. I told her that my bones ached. I told her that my mouth was dry. I couldn't focus, that some days they'd be without mercy and I'd be trapped in bed for the whole day. But the days that I wasn't, I wanted to make the most of it. I wanted to breathe the air and I wanted to live. She told me she understood it's hard, but she didn't really offer more than that. She just pointed at the booklet and told me to follow it. I asked her about things like heavy metal poisoning, about chronically reactivating viruses, about defective mitochondria, about all the things that I read that were linked to chronic.
I can guarantee with someone like Ren that does so much online research and is a very intelligent person that he's going to probably far surpass pretty quickly the person who's running this class in terms of understanding things related to his illness and what all these people are experiencing in general.
Chronic fatigue, but she just raised an eyebrow, looked at me like I was a hypochondriac and told me she knew nothing about those things. I remember walking out of the building feeling disheartened and defeated, so much so that my legs buckled as I was walking home. I began to sob uncontrollably on the side of the road. An old woman knelt down to comfort me and asked me what was wrong. I didn't even really know how to explain, so I just told her that I missed my friend. Despite my skepticism, I stuck to the program for at least half a year, and I kept going for my periodic visits to the clinic, and it did jack shit. In fact, I got worse. I was always getting worse. One thing that particularly struck me about the ME support groups was the pure desperation and confusion. With most other conditions, you're given a diagnosis, a prognosis of whether it's going to kill you, and what you can do to manage it or cure it. With ME, you don't get that. You get an indeterminately long sentence to purgatory. You feel worse than you've ever felt in your whole life, and you're given no explanation as to why, and no signpost pointing the way out.
It makes you wonder with Ren, they eventually figured out what it was. I think for most people with something like this, they just don't. But it makes you also wonder, like, is there something simple? Like, for him, I don't want to say it was simple figuring it out, but at the end of the day, they know exactly what it was, and the cause was a, straightforward thing. And I wonder if that's the case for a lot of people that have something like this. It's a different cause, presumably, right? It's not going to be Lyme disease for everybody. But I wonder how many people the solution is something that's kind of straightforward if they can just figure out what it is or what the cause is, right? Um, just curious. I don't know the answer, and I suppose nobody really knows the answer, because if they did, they'd be curing these people.
There was no selection bias to the people suffering. Members of the group were anything from esteemed ex-lawyers to single parents to former athletes. One thing I can say, these people were for the most part all extremely driven and collectively mourning their old lives. There's a stigma that because ME's predominant presentation of symptoms is tiredness, that its victims are just being lazy. I can tell you firsthand that me and every single person I've met with genuine ME would rather run 1,000 marathons than have to live another week with the tiredness and the unrelenting fatigue. We were at war with our tiredness, trying desperately to escape it, and some of us would go to extreme lengths to turn ourselves into guinea pigs to try and find ways out. Suicide was pretty common in those online support groups. It was around this time I was swallowed into the music industry. I was out busking on the streets one day and I noticed this sketchy, good-looking Mauritian guy with his arms crossed watching me, really intensely, as though he was studying every lyric coming out of my mouth. He approached me and asked me if the songs I was singing were mine. I said they were. A big smile was painted across his face, and he told me he just finished recording Plan B's latest record, which turned out to be The Defamation of Strickland Banks, one of my favourite albums of all time. He was looking for a new project to sink his teeth into, and he asked me if I'd come to London to record. We got into it. The whole time I felt dreadful, but this was a lifelong dream material.
So this is interesting. I had mentioned this in the Chapter 2 video that he didn't talk about this yet, and I thought there was maybe just going to be like timeline jumping around. I was under the impression from earlier interviews or whatever that Ren had started working on this album and then started getting sick. I didn't realize he was already, months or years into this with no prognosis, going to these groups kind of things before this happened. This is interesting.
We got into it. The whole time I felt dreadful, but this was a lifelong dream materializing in front of my eyes.
And I guess this might explain my confusion around his solo work with this album recording versus the Trick the Fox things that he talked about in the last video. He hasn't said anything about it here, but I'm assuming at this point that he's not actually been playing with Trick the Fox anymore. Maybe because he got so sick he couldn't do it.
The whole time I felt dreadful, but this was a lifelong dream materializing in front of my eyes. So bit by bit, when I could, I'd get the train to London and start chipping away at my first ever album. I didn't really let on how I was feeling during this time because I didn't want to sabotage it. There would be times I'd finish up in the vocal booth after doing the take, excuse myself to go to the toilet, throw up from the dizziness I was experiencing, sometimes with specks of blood, and then I'd go back and pretend that nothing had happened. I'd be sitting around with the whole room spinning and would pretend I was fine. There was only so long that I was able to keep this up. Eric told me it'd be a cool idea for me to start going to industry showcases and start building buzz. Performing live like this was a whole new level of taxing that I wasn't ready for, but I was so ferociously ambitious that I just ploughed through. The usual way it would go is I'd be in the back of Charlie's car, the whole world would be spinning.
All right, so it sounds like it still is Trick the Fox stuff then.
I'd be trying my best to sleep in it all day, parked up outside of whatever venue or pub it was in London, trying to conserve energy for the show.
And like we said, it's not, you don't have a number of units. I think conserving energy with something like this isn't necessarily going to be super helpful.
Sometimes I'd cry a little before I performed. My whole body would be burning. Then I'd brush it off and I'd get on stage and I'd perform as best I could. People would come up to me at the end, pat me on the back. I'd smile and pretend to be charismatic. Then I'd get back in the car and I wish I was in bed and have to endure a 3-hour drive back to Bath from London. There was only a few shows where I could keep pretending. I'd usually be trying to disguise the fact that my body was trembling through the fatigue and pain. Eventually I started crying mid-set. It became blindingly obvious to everyone working with me during that time that something was very wrong. I told Eric that I needed to take some time out. My plan was to live at home with my mum for a month maximum, get my energy back, and come and finish the record. That 1 month turned into 2 months, turned into 3 months, turned into 6 months. I'd pushed myself to total burnout. The distance led to me and that angel breaking up, in part because it was difficult to navigate a relationship when you have so much brain fog, and I didn't know what it was well enough to be able to explain it to her at the time. With a loud thud, I'd been jolted out of a Shakespearean storyline, I lost a record deal, and I couldn't get out of bed. My friends from Trick the Fox never really called to check up on me. It felt like the whole world was moving at lightning speed without me. I had this amazing opportunity right in front of me, and I was chained to the floor. I was alone, I was sick. I wished that my condition would get it over with and kill me, but it wouldn't, and it felt cruel that it wouldn't. It just let me rot in bed. The whole world would continue to turn, and I would rot. In the next episode, I'm going to tell you about a fight with a television and losing my anal virginity to an 80-year-old man. Stay tuned for that.
All right, this is usually where they move to one of the songs. I say usually, like I've got 2 data points, right? Chapter 1 and 2, but I imagine he'll stick with that. We've got, what, 3 minutes left? Oh, Depression. Terrible. I mean, great song, but hard to listen to.
My thought patterns are composed by a time bomb for an author, like pigs to the slaughter. A symphony of self-doubt sings out, breath starts getting shorter, running water. It's the state that I wish to become. Instead, concrete envelops my movement and I'm rendered deaf and dumb, unable to heed the advice of others. Don't tell me things will get better, cause so far things haven't gotten better. I've got the sweater, poster child, bipolar, ADHD, therapist, wet dream. I don't want to talk about my father, I don't want to talk about my dead friend, I don't want to talk about myself. I'm sick of talking about myself. I'm sick of talking about myself and realizing that talking about myself never ever helps. Still, I call for help.
You know, I've never really, to my knowledge, had to deal with depression at this level. I mean, I think we've all been there a little bit, but not like clinical, massive depression like people like this have to deal with. But I've watched reaction videos from this song from people that have suffered from depression pretty heavily. And once again, I think this is one of those cases where Ren can really sing things in a way that very clearly describes what people are feeling, like very complex emotions, and just the way he lyricizes things just describes it perfectly. And like I said, I can't relate to this one in an intimate way, but I do know that it breaks my heart.
Cause I really want help, but the pills didn't seem to help, and the therapist didn't seem to help, but still I want help. I've danced with the devil in hell, I've sat in a prisonless cell, and here I always dwell, in this prison in myself. I do this thing when my mind travels back to the golden age, you know.
This is one of those parts of songs where you have to have a really good sound system or headphones on to hear like the whispers that happen over some of the things in the background that just make it a little bit more kind of intense, almost without you noticing.
I've sat in a prisonless cell, and here I always dwell, in this prison in myself. I do this thing when my mind travels back to the golden age. You know those times where you were carefree and everything was golden? The golden age. You know those times where everything was golden, where you were carefree and everything was golden? The hardest thing I ever had to do was come to terms with the fact that that time never really existed. I've always felt so fucking detached and broken, bruised and mismatched. Find it hard to relax, living under the cracks. Tried to fill in the gaps, lying here on my back.
I always thought that this break right there is one of my favorite, like, song switches that I've ever heard. It happens in a couple, and they usually tend to be related to these type songs, right? Ren's, this one, Depression, and Insomnia has another similar kind of switch to where he's almost just like doing spoken word type things, and then all of a sudden it breaks into really cool instrumental and lyrical stuff. But this switch right here with that background kind of humming, so good. But again, the topic is just heartbreaking.
Really existed. I've always felt so fucking detached and broken, bruised and mismatched. Find it hard to relax, living under the cracks. Tried to fill in the gaps, lying here on my back. Still, I can't find it. Sense of peace in my mind declined it. Pulse increase and my sweat combines with a feeling so deep I fall inside it. depression. I hate you, depression. Your constant oppression. Respond with aggression. They say depression brings you lessons. Constant stressing conceals blessings. You will grow in broken settings. Fuck those lessons, fuck depression. I've been living in your shadow for so long that I forgot how I can shine. How I can find a refuge in my mind. How am I meant to...
There's a similar sentiment in another song. I'm trying to remember what it is. Everybody Drops, maybe. We kind of like talks about fuck fate. And, you know, the whole thing about like people saying, you know, bad things give you lessons and whatever. It's like, I've had enough lessons, right? But boy, everything going on here in this groove, and then this cowbell comes in. That's just got such a strange time compared to everything else. And I can't quite count it out if it's like doing some weird, you know, like time signature thing or whatever, but it's so like conflicting with everything else in the groove that's going on that I think is a great way to musically represent the dissonance that's happening to people that are dealing with this. Usually, you know, musically, people would do that with like kind of, you know, strange diminished chord clashes or something. But this timing of this cowbell is just so like off the beat for me. Now, maybe I'm completely wrong. Maybe it's perfectly on there and I'm just all messed up on this. It's always possible, but
They say depression brings you lessons. Constant stressing conceals blessings. You will grow in broken settings. Fuck those lessons, fuck depression. I've been living in your shadow for so long that I forgot how I can shine. How I can find a refuge in my mind. How am I meant to sit here and unwind? The planets align. I feel like I'm cursed. Feel like I'm cursed to just be here to hurt. Feel like I'm cursed to just be here to bleed. But my demon's been feeling this way since birth. Depression, I hate you. 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 Depression, I hate you.
man, that's brutal. I mean, the story is really interesting, and it's definitely taking me places that I didn't think it would go in terms of how certain things were timed. And, you know, it's funny how he talked about at the end of chapter 2 that he met this angel. It was his first real girlfriend. And he didn't really say anything about that whole thing. So I guess there's probably a desire to keep all of that private. But it meant enough to him that he mentioned it, didn't go into any details, and now he talked about the breakup. He didn't really talk about the breakup. He just kind of said, I moved away. It was rough. Couldn't have the long distance relationship, you know, broke up. He didn't say who that was or anything. But man, it's a little funny how he ends with, you know, you know, I don't know that I would call it a joke necessarily, because I'm sure in some way it's real. But, you know, he mentions losing his anal virginity to an 80-year-old man or whatever. Like, clearly, I don't know if that's some sort of a medicine thing or something. But it's almost like he had to pick you up a little bit from the story before he played this song for you. Because, boy, this song's never easy to listen to. Wow. All right, chapter 3. You know, I feel like my mind and heart have been pulled a lot of different ways already, and it's only 3 out of 8. And I don't want to space these out too much, but I can't do them too quickly one after another either. I need a little bit of a breather. It's like I'm gonna have to go listen to baby metal or something to kind of get myself into a different headspace. In any case, thanks everybody for being here. As always, I hope you're doing well, and I will see you again hopefully for chapter 4. Thanks a lot.